The moment has arrived for our very special award tonight, the Global Justice and Peace Award. And all of you that have seen the publicity that DJPC has put out know that it's going to go to Aviva Chomsky, who's here with us tonight. And to introduce her is Aaron Schneider. Aaron.
Thanks, Jack. Like everybody besides Jack, I need a much lower microphone. I'm really happy and that I can be up here, and I just feel lucky that I can share tonight with you all here at DJPC, that I get to be married to the director of DJPC, and that means that I get invited occasionally to do these kinds of participations. I'm introducing Aviva Chomsky, Professor of History and Coordinator of Latin American, Latino and Caribbean Studies at Salem State University in Massachusetts. Her books include Undocumented, How Immigration Became Illegal, A History of the Cuban Revolution, Linked Labor Histories, New England, Colombia, and the Making of a Global Working Class, They Take Our Jobs, and 20 Other Myths About Immigration, and West Indian Workers in the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica. She's been active in Latin American solidarity and immigrants' rights movements for several decades. I want to highlight two things that stand out as I looked over her bio. First, Avi explicitly requested that I mention that her entire career and outlook was shaped in 1976 when she worked in Anaheim with the United Farm Workers. As it happens, one of her colleagues there was John Proctor, who went on to be the first organizer of DJPC and a longtime supporter, and the eponymous source of the John Proctor Award that my colleague at University of Denver, Lynn, just received. Someday somebody should make a list of the legions of organizers and intellectuals and academics whose lives were shaped by formative struggles with organizations like the UFW and other organizations fighting for those who are marginalized. The second thing I want to observe, to note, is the reason that I'm especially pleased to introduce Avi. As you may know, I'm a professor at the Denver School of International Studies, which means that I've thought a lot about what kind of an academic or what kind of a scholar I'd like to be. And Avi is two things. She's smart and she's good. As an academic, I often meet people who are smart. They do rigorous, interesting scholarship. Occasionally, I also meet people who are good, guided by the principles like those that Avi learned with the UFW. But rarely do you meet scholars who are both smart and good. When you read her work, like her work on immigration, like the book entitled They Take Our Jobs and 20 Other Myths About Immigration, you see what it takes to be smart and good. Avi identifies myths, such as the notion that one can support immigration but oppose illegal immigration. She traces the notion, the history of rules that make certain immigrants legal while others are illegal or simply barred. Until 1924, white Europeans could show up at Ellis Island, occasionally without even a passport, and immigration was legal and easy. Meanwhile, until 1861, Africans were trafficked to the US and barred from citizenship as slaves. Asian men could come as workers, but neither be citizens nor bring their family members. Native Americans already living here were declared unwelcome, less than citizens, and slaughtered en masse. So by doing rigorous historical research and targeting mistaken and dangerous ideas and ideals, Avi changes minds, makes a new history, and challenges injustice. I should mention that I highlighted her work on immigration because I'm hoping that we can all ask her in the question and answer time about that work and to elaborate on the work on immigration. For now, she's going to talk to us about, in more depth about one of her ongoing projects, looking at worker environmental struggles in Colombia, a topic on which she's already published an edited book, The People Behind Colombian Coal, Mining, Multinationals, and Human Rights. She's a smart and good scholar. I'm honored to introduce her, and it's an honor to have her here with us at DJPC. Do I give her the prize now? Yes? Okay, you don't have to hold it while you're giving the talk.
Okay.
Is it this one? Both of them together, okay. You hold that one. Cheers. DJPC.
So thank you so much, Erin, for that beautiful introduction, and thank you so much to all of you. I'm extremely honored to be here tonight, and to everyone in DJPC, and just hearing about all the work that you have been doing over the past 36 years is really humbling. And I feel like usually when I stand before an audience, I feel like I have to do a lot of education, and that's why I'm there, because people haven't thought through how the world works. And my job is to try to open a few doors and give a few clues as to how the world works, to try to make people outraged, to try to make them want to mobilize and become activists. But I don't have to do that here, because you guys are already longtime activists, and it's really impressive and humbling to be here with you. So maybe I don't have to give a talk at all. But there are nevertheless a few things that I would like to say. It was really wonderful to hear people talking about Nicaragua, and to have the evening open with Cristo de Palacagüino, one of my favorite songs. And while I do trace a lot of my intellectual and academic work back to my time with the United Farm Workers, and the reason for that is that is where I first thought about labor and what it means, where I first thought about consumption and like how everything that we consume has a history, and that history is tied up with labor. That is, fruits and vegetables, they aren't just things you find in the supermarket. They got there through a lot of hard work, but that work is invisible. So the invisibility of the labor behind what we consume is a question that has motivated me intellectually and academically. It was in the farm workers where I was first exposed to Spanish, first exposed to issues of immigration, and these are all the issues that have motivated me academically and intellectually, and led me into Latin American history, labor history, and a lot of the work that I do and writing that I do. But in terms of my solidarity work, which is of course very deeply connected too, I think one of the most important lessons that I learned, and this isn't in my official bio, but one of the most important lessons I learned that still continues to guide me and I think about frequently was in Nicaragua when I was there in 1987 and 1988. And one of the things that I did there was to meet with the mothers of Matagalpa, the mothers of children who had been killed by the Contra forces in the Contra war, basically by my government, by this proxy army created and funded by my government. And I was with a delegation of Americans who were there, and we sat around in a circle and listened to the stories of the mothers. And everybody in the delegation said, we want to help you, what can we do, how can we help you? No, we're here to support you, we're here to help you, what can we do? And the mothers said something that I've heard over and over again over the years as I've been engaged in solidarity work, which is, you can't do anything for us here. We don't need your help here. If you want to help us, you can go home and change what your government is doing. That's how you can help us. And I think that's a lesson that I think everybody here in this room already knows, and that's what you're doing. And yet I think it's a lesson that can never be repeated enough times. And when I'm giving talks, talking about Colombia, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight, that lesson comes back to me constantly. And when people say, what can we do? Their first thought is always, well, I want to go down to Colombia and help people. And the people who we work with in Colombia say exactly the same thing to us today, that we don't need your help here in Colombia. We need you to change what your government is doing. So what I want to talk about tonight is environment, labor, and social justice, three sides of the same coin. I want to talk about the campaign I've been involved in Colombia, but some of the ways that being involved in this campaign has made me think more deeply about how the world works and what kinds of change we're trying to bring about in the world. And two questions or puzzles or problems that have accompanied me in this work. One is the absolute urgency of climate change. And a few years ago, I was in a bookstore in Harvard Square, and I pulled out my credit card to buy a couple of used books. And the young man who was working the cash register said, "Oh, I know you work on all these human rights and social justice issues, and I used to do that too." You know, he saw my name on the credit card and he recognized it. I used to do that too, but now I think the only important issue is climate change. Like, that's just so urgent that we can't worry about anything else. We just have to work on climate change. And I thought, but climate change isn't a separate issue from social justice. So that's one of the puzzles and issues, is like, how can we work on anything else when the only important issue is climate change? So that's why I titled this talk, Environment, Labor, and Social Justice, Three Sides of the Same Coin. The other puzzle and question and challenge that I've come up against is the apparent conflict in the United States between labor issues and environmental issues. So often, problems come down to something that I've seen in my very own hometown of Salem, Massachusetts, where until about a year ago, we had a large coal-fired power plant. And this power plant imported its coal from Colombia, which is how I first started getting interested in coal mining in Colombia, which is what I am going to talk about when I finish this overlong introduction. But there were local environmental organizations that wanted to close down the power plant, that from an environmental perspective said we should not be burning coal. It causes local pollution, it causes global climate change. We need to shut down this power plant. And then there were the unionized workers at the power plant who said, all those environmentalists, they only care about saving spotted owls. They don't care about people, real working people. They're all like rich liberals who live in their big houses and aren't thinking about the workers who need the jobs. They are willing to throw us out of a job for some lofty ideals that aren't even going to make any difference. So the question, is there a contradiction between jobs and environment? Is there a contradiction between the labor movement and the environment? And I think that the labor movement in the United States has been under siege. It's a very complex movement with many different political ideologies and goals inside of it. But I also think that understanding the work that people do and how central that work that people do is to all of our lives, and understanding the role of the labor movements historically in social change and in Latin America in social change, helps us to transcend this apparent contradiction between jobs and environment, or labor and environmental movements, and also relates to the first question about, well, how can we think about anything else if we're thinking about environment? And I would say, well, no, we actually always have to be thinking about everything. But fortunately, it's not that hard. Okay, so just to begin talking about climate change and our energy use and just how drastic this situation is. Obviously, world leaders are going to be meeting in Paris next week to talk about this, and they're probably going to do nothing, as they have in every previous international meeting that tries to address this issue that is truly threatening the future of the human race. World energy consumption, especially in the post-World War II period, has risen drastically. And despite all of the efforts that have been made to reduce our use of fossil fuels, despite all of the research, all of the funding that has gone into alternative energy, you can see that alternative energy practically doesn't even feature in this picture. And this goes up, this this graph that I show you here goes up to the year 2000. If you can go to the next slide, just in case you think anything has changed since 2000, it hasn't. This takes us from I wanted to show you the whole last 2 centuries to show just how grave the changes in recent years have been. But this takes us from 1965, when we're already very high, to the present. And you can see that since 2000, we have only continued to increase our use of oil, gas, and coal, and that the so-called alternative fuels like solar and wind occupy a very small amount. This one goes up to 2014, so you can see just how bad the situation is. And to make things even worse, I didn't include the slide that shows you the role that the United States plays in this big picture, because our per capita energy use is so much higher than anywhere else in the world that with approximately 6% of the planet's population, we use about 30% of the planet's energy resources, and our use is only increasing. Can we go one more slide? But this is not just an environmental issue. This is also a social justice issue. In fact, the coal that we have been burning in our power plants along the east coast of the United States comes from Colombia. And just to add to the complexity, Colombia is not historically a coal-producing country, but it was the Clean Air Act in the United States that pushed Colombia into seeking foreign investors to develop its coal industry. Because Colombian coal is very clean burning coal. And the Clean Air Act in the 1970s put in very gradual restrictions on the amount of pollution that coal burning power plants are allowed to emit. So how do coal burning power plants increase the amount of coal they're burning while emitting fewer particles of sulfur and nitrates? They do it by burning cleaner coal. Now, this coal might look cleaner at the smokestacks in Salem, Massachusetts, but it looks a lot dirtier in Colombia, where entire provinces have been turned over to open-pit coal mining. It also looks kind of bad from a labor perspective, where a company like Exxon, we think of Exxon as an oil company, right? But Exxon was actually a major coal producer in the United States as well until the 1970s, until they saw which way the wind was blowing and said, we should really close our coal mines in Illinois, at around the same time that the Drummond Company was saying we should really close our coal mines in Alabama and move our investment over to Colombia. There's a better market for the coal because it's cleaner, and it's a lot cheaper to produce the coal in Colombia because Colombia's environmental regulations are nowhere near those in the United States. Colombia's health and safety regulations for the workers in the mines are nowhere near what they are in the United States. And Colombian wages are nowhere near what they are in the United States. And the United States government is helping Colombia, the government of Colombia, to make sure that this situation continues. And that's why I really like this little map that sort of shows us the political economy of unequal exchange. That is, the United States is sending arms, helicopters, and advisors to Colombia, while Colombia is sending coal to the United States. And those arms, helicopters, and advisors have been put to good use in Colombia, making it the most dangerous country in the world to be a labor unionist. That is, more union workers and union activists have been killed in Colombia over the past 20 years than anywhere else in the world. Okay, let's... So a lot of changes have been happening in Latin America in the last 15 years or so. The 1990s were the period of neoliberal reforms in Latin America, when the United States seemed to be getting its way everywhere. The revolutionary movements of the 1980s had, many of them, been crushed. The peace agreements in Guatemala and El Salvador enabled the United States to put into place its neoliberal agenda. We have NAFTA signed with Mexico, the Central America DR Free Trade Agreement, and the implementation of structural adjustment programs that are opening new benefits and facilities for foreign corporations while lowering the costs of production by government cutbacks to social services and programs for protecting the rights of citizens. But towards the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s, we see the left coming back into power in Latin America, and popular movements all over Latin America coming into government in places like Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile. So Colombia, through the 1990s, remained the one reliable US ally, as much of the rest of Latin America was moving to the left. Colombia continued in the neoliberal model, and it's not coincidental. We saw in the 1980s that you could draw a very clear correlation between US military aid to a country, like, say, El Salvador, and human rights violations in that country. That is, wherever the US military aid is going is where there's the greatest amount of human rights violations. This continues in the 1990s with Colombia, or in the 2000s with Colombia, as other countries in Latin America are moving to the left, greatest recipient of US military aid and greatest committer of human rights violations. But the invisible part of this is also the opening of Colombia to multinational corporations, extractivism, mining and energy companies, some of them from the United States, some of them from Europe, some of them from Asia. The United States continuing, though, to be the biggest recipient of exports, especially gas, oil, and coal from Colombia. So this map from 2010 shows us that 40% of Colombia's national territory by 2010 had been solicited by foreign mining and energy companies. So some have called the new extractivism the new imperialism in Latin America, when so much of a country's territory ends up in the hands of foreign corporations. So I want to zero in, next slide, on one very particular part of Colombia, the northeasternmost part of Colombia, along the Caribbean Sea and along the border with Venezuela, the part of Colombia called La Guajira, which is where the biggest coal deposits are. You can see the coast up along the north and the border with Venezuela along the south of La Guajira Peninsula. And you see, what's the name of that shape? It's been a long time since I took geometry. It's not a rectangle. It's not a trapezoid. You see it though, right? This thing. Is it a trapezoid? Okay, so it hasn't been that long since I took geometry. Is the main area, it says Zona Mina, the mining zone, of the Cerrejón Zona Norte coal mine. This mine was started as a joint venture. The Colombian government opened this area for bidding, and Exxon won the bid in 1976. They did their exploration from 1976 to 1980 and started the process of building a coal mine in 1982. So let's go to the next slide. So the Guajira Peninsula obviously was inhabited, as all of the Americas have been inhabited for 500 years. One of the differences in La Guajira Peninsula is that until Exxon came there, it was virtually unconquered territory. That is, there had been incursions, repeated incursions by the Spanish in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. There were attempts at missionary activity there. By the Carmelites, and there were attempts by the Colombian national government to actually incorporate this territory into the national state. But those attempts had been relatively unsuccessful. Of course, the area was not completely isolated, but neither was it really incorporated into the national state. It's a very desert-like area, inhabited by the Wayuu indigenous people, the largest indigenous group in Colombia, also one of the most unknown indigenous groups in Colombia. Unknown because their land and their lifestyle and their economy are so different from the Andean indigenous peoples. Most of Colombia's indigenous peoples live in the Andes. And their history goes all the way back to the Inca Empire. The Wayuu were never conquered by the Incas, and they're a Caribbean people whose language, culture is very different from those of the Andes or those of the Amazon, who are the better known Colombian indigenous people, but they are actually the largest indigenous group. This photograph was taken in 1982 when the mining company was just beginning its explorations. In addition to the indigenous population of La Guajira, there's also a significant population of African origin, peoples who, starting in the 1600s and 1700s, were able to escape from the slave economy, either the slave economy of the Caribbean or the slave economy of the central areas of Colombia, and fled to La Guajira because of its remoteness and the lack of any state authority there. So it's a land that was inhabited by indigenous Wayuu people and settled by self-freed African people who formed independent communities. They were cimarrones, these were palenques. They were independent communities founded by free people of African descent who self-freed themselves, and who have very proud and strong oral histories about how they came to be there and the lives they made for themselves there. Okay, so this is the one I was expecting to come up next. So none of these people have any place in the plans of Exxon. During the conquest of the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, the Spanish were trying to force people to work for them. When the Spanish established their mines in the Andes, in Mexico, throughout the Americas, they needed a workforce. These were underground mines that required a lot of labor. The plantations started by the Spanish, the sugar plantations, the coffee plantations, the henequen plantations, they all needed a lot of labor. But an open pit coal mine in the 21st century hardly needs any labor at all. And the labor that it needs is not the labor of the indigenous and Afro-descended people of La Guajira. What this open pit coal mine needs is heavy machinery operators and heavy machinery repair people. So as this mine grew, it actually came to employ a significant number of people, but these were urban, educated, technically trained people, not the people of La Guajira, where the illiteracy rate is still 65%. And that just goes to show what little state presence there has been there. So the people there simply have no place in the plans of the modern global economy. They're not going to be coerced as workers. They're just going to be removed from their territories. They're what the Indian historian Ramachandra Guha calls ecological refugees. He divides the world into 3 types of people. There's the omnivores. That's people like us. That's people who consume resources from all over the world. We're like the resource drains. We suck them up from everywhere, so we're the omnivores. There are what he calls ecosystems peoples. These are people who live within the means of their region. They may consume things from outside their region that they obtain through trade, but they maintain a relatively equal relationship with their environment and with the peoples who inhabit environments around them, unlike the omnivores who we just take, we don't give anything. But he argues that in the post-World War II period, ecosystems peoples have increasingly been turned into ecological refugees by omnivores. Does everybody follow that? So people like us are turning the last remaining ecosystems peoples of the world into ecological refugees. So it's one thing to read this, and it's another thing to see it happening close up in a place like La Guajira, where I know that those ships that are taking the coal out of La Guajira are coming to Salem so that we can use all the electricity we use. Let's go to the next slide. So this is what an open pit coal mine looks like. This is what has happened to that land where we saw people living in 1982. This mine is a mile deep, so when you stand, Denver's a mile high, right? So yeah, when you stand at the edge of it and look down, like the trucks, and you can barely see the people, and the trucks look like little toy tiny trucks. It's 40 miles long, this mining concession, divided into numerous pits, and at first I thought it was bizarre that they named the pits after the communities that were displaced from each area. So like there's the Tobacco pit, which is where the village of Tobacco used to stand. And there's the Patilla pit, where the village of Patilla used to stand. But then I realized that I live in a state called Massachusetts. Everybody get it? Like a settler colony founded on indigenous land where it was named after the indigenous people who used to live there. So what's happening in La Guajira today isn't really all that different from 500 years of colonialism in many ways. But speaking of tobacco, let's move to the next slide. The village of Tobacco is one of a number of villages that have been forcibly displaced by the mine. Most of the villages have been forcibly displaced in a more protracted and subtle way. That is, they've been forcibly displaced by the company buying out individual residents in the villages, making them offers, making them threats, threatening that their children will be taken away from them because they're going to be turned over to social services for not putting their children's best interest first if they refuse to take the company's offer and leave their ancestral homelands. But in the village of Tabaco in 2001, the residents decided to resist, and they decided to join together and that they were not going to take the company's offers and that they were going to refuse to leave. And what they were demanding was a collective resettlement. So they weren't completely refusing to leave, but they were refusing to leave the way the company wanted them to leave, that is, one by one. They said, we are a village that has been here for hundreds of years. We have a collective economy. We farm our land collectively. We hold our animals collectively. And we're willing to be relocated, but we want to be relocated as agricultural people with land where we can continue to live the collective lifestyle that we have lived for hundreds of years. And the mine said no, and on August 9th, 2001, came in with a strong contingent of private security from the company and the Colombian security forces, and began to literally drag people out of their houses and bulldoze the houses. And now Tabaco lies under the pit. So let's move to the next slide. One village that is still in the process of relocation, of negotiation with the mine, and one of the things that the first time I went to Colombia was in 2006. Tobacco had already been, not the first time I went to Colombia, but the first time I went to La Guajira, the first time I went to this coal mine. Tobacco had already been destroyed, but there was a committee for the relocation of Tobacco still demanding that they be recognized and be relocated, because when the people were dispersed, they were simply dispersed with nowhere to go. And if any of you has ever been in a third world city, I'm sure you've seen the slums that ring every third world city. Many of them are these ecological refugees, people who were self-sufficient, who were ecosystems peoples, who were displaced, and for whom there is no place in today's global economy. The village of Chancleta was in resistance, refusing to leave and demanding collective negotiations with the company. And you can see in the bottom photo here some of the houses of Chancleta with the waste dump, the overburden dump from the mine right behind the village. And when you saw that picture of the mine, you saw how there's these sort of mountains of earth behind it. And we'll just take a look at one more YU village. Of Tomic, which was also, so the villages were joining together in 2006 and demanding a collective relocation. And they told us the same thing that I learned in 1987 in Nicaragua, that they felt that our solidarity as foreigners, especially as foreigners from the countries that are the consumers of this coal and the countries where the companies that own the mine are from, that we are the ones who are in a position to put pressure on these mines, and not in the least on the Colombian government, on the US government, which holds so much control over the Colombian government. So the campaign began with people from these villages reminding us that not only are we benefiting from this system, but we're also in a position where we can bring about change in this system. I want to skip forward to, because I see I'm out of time, but I just wanted to show you one more thing, because I could kind of talk forever here. One of the things that's really interesting in the struggle in Colombia is the extent to which the workers in the mine, the unionized workers in the mine, express their solidarity with the communities that are being displaced. For them, the mine is an environmental disaster that is destroying their country, that is destroying their homeland. So from the perspective of the workers in the mine, They, as workers, the communities that are being displaced, and their country are all victims of imperialism, are victims of this global system. And working with the workers in the mine, we also learned that one of the ways that this system remains in place, and one of the ways that the United States is holding this system in place through its military aid, much of which, as has been demonstrated by Human Rights Watch, has gone into the hands of the paramilitaries, which Human Rights Watch calls the 6th Brigade, because of the way that it's integrated into the Colombian military, has been through violent repression of unions. And in the coal union office in the city of Valledupar, the photographs of the 3 murdered coal union leaders who were killed in 2001, the president, vice president, and the man who succeeded to the presidency after the president and vice president were killed, all killed in 2001 in March and then again in October, serves as a sobering reminder of just how much power we in this country have, how much autonomy we in this country have to protest, even if we don't take advantage of it, and how extremely difficult it is for people in Colombia to protest, and yet they continue to protest. And one of the things that most shocks me when I'm speaking to audiences in the United States, not this audience, but general audiences in the United States, is the sense of powerlessness that people in this country have. People always say, well, what can we do? We can't bring about any change. The system is too big. The system is too strong. It's not worth doing anything. It's too hard. It's not going to matter anyway. I've never heard somebody say that in Colombia. Despite all of the obstacles, all of the difficulties, all of the repression, they always have 1,000 ideas about what they can do to protest, to stand up for their rights. And when we think about the grave inequalities in the resources that we command, both the material resources in terms of we're the ones who are using this coal, and the political resources, that is, we're not going to end up like these 3 union leaders on the wall, murdered. We can really do and say anything that we want, and we're the owners of the companies, and we're the ones who can influence the government, just how important this solidarity is. And both for the villagers and for the unions, when they find themselves under threat, they never hesitate to remind us how important our solidarity is to their struggle and their safety. So I know you guys already know that, but I'm telling you it again. Thank you. The weak point of the mining companies is their international image. They are really sensitive about their international image. And we are the people best placed to attack nonviolently, obviously, their international image. That is, the people in the unions, the people in the communities, the only means they have to reach an international audience is through us. And whether it's through going to shareholders meetings, bringing people from Colombia to from the region to the shareholders meetings so that the shareholders are hearing, whether it's lobbying the companies that are buying this coal, whether it's working against Plan Colombia and US military aid to Colombia in the US government. We bring a lot of people here on speaking tours, and all the things that we do are the things we learned from the Central America Solidarity Movement of the 1980s, of how to get these voices out to affect public opinion, just that in this case, it's not just public opinion in trying to affect the US government, but trying to directly affect the companies. because clearly the US government plays a big role, but the companies themselves are sort of almost become the governing bodies in these remote regions where they're working.
So shaming them reflects on their finances, basically.
Yes, or at least it makes them fear that it will reflect on their finances, yeah. And I mean, strangely enough, in some ways, even though like we have supposedly a democracy and we can affect what the government does, affecting what the companies do, even though like there's no democracy in the companies, the vulnerability of their images gives us a kind of a power that, and you know, earlier tonight we were talking about the Nestle boycott. Those kinds of, the companies are vulnerable because they have to sell.
I'm going to stand up because I'm used to standing up and I'm saying something. Could you comment on two books or pieces that have been published recently in the last year or so? Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, and how, in her view, there's just an economic incompatibility between capitalism, unlimited growth, unlimited profit, unlimited consumerism, and a healthy earth. And also the Pope's encyclical, as a liberation theology Christian Catholic, which is near and dear to my heart, the Pope's encyclical on care for our common home, Laudato Si, which is from a poem by St. Francis about the care of the earth. Could you comment on those and how they may have dovetailed with what you're trying to do, or where maybe you diverge from those, or where there's this synergy that's moving across the planet? Jack talked about all of these organizations just in Colorado that are doing this kind of work in solidarity with us, and so maybe you could just comment on those two and what your ideas are about those.
So both of those works are really inspiring pieces of work for our time, and I think both of them do some of the things that I was trying to do tonight, which is to talk about the ways that struggles for social justice cannot be separated from the struggle to halt climate change.
And I forgot one thing. The Pope says whatever we do, we have to pay attention to the plight of the poor. Everything we do about this, and we need to do things, we have to look at how it affects the poor.
And part of the struggle for social justice is gaining a deeper understanding of the role that our country plays and the role that the way we live plays. And I think this is one of the ways in which Naomi Klein calls the people, I can't remember the term she uses, but the people like the people in Colombia who are struggling, the people who are on the front lines of the battle against climate change are the people who are struggling against extractivism, whether it's against mountaintop removal in Appalachia, West Virginia, Kentucky, or she doesn't talk about this coal mine in Colombia specifically, but she does talk about some of the anti-mining struggles in Latin America as well. Naomi Klein definitely conceptualizes our economic system as the problem. And it's an economic system based on ever-increasing consumption. And what she calls for, she articulates it as a New Deal for the planet. The New Deal did not try to overturn capitalism, right? She's making a comparison to the New Deal of the 1930s. She is calling, I don't think in that book that she's really calling for an end to capitalism. She calls for a new deal for the planet, for a global effort to strongly regulate capitalism, to bring it under control. What she wants to end or overturn is neoliberal capitalism, and to on a global scale, create something like a heavily regulated system. So I think on one hand that this is much easier to conceptualize for many members of her audience than actually calling for an end to capitalism would be. But personally, I think I'd rather end capitalism altogether than just regulate it more heavily.
Have you had a chance to read the Pope's encyclical?
I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read parts of it.
Good. It's a good read. It's very inspiring.
And I mean, in some ways, I think he goes further than Naomi Klein does in naming the system and looking at how the whole system works.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, well, I hope you can understand me because my English isn't very well. I'm a Spanish speaker. I'm from Mexico. My name is Ishmael. Thank you for being here. You're number one of your father's fan. And secondly, now I have the honor and the pleasure to meet you. And it's really, really nice for me being a Mexican from my origin. I'm from Mexico. And it's very interesting how you people, you, the audience, are being here, being white people, interesting on Latin American issues. I have to thank you for that. I have to thank you for your effort about, I don't know the word, but you are doing a really good job with your books and all the effort you are doing. I would like to say something about Mexico on those recent years. All of you have done or have you witnessed on the past, on the 80s, or since the 80s, or from the 80s till now, I think it wasn't so hard as it is on Mexico nowadays. I think you guys must be aware that probably on Colombia it wasn't too hard. It wasn't so many deaths on the people. Now, this displacing on Mexico is terrible. It's horrific how this is going. Presidente Enrique Peña Nieto, he's selling all our minerals, all our oil, all our silver, gold, everything. The example you made on Colombia is exactly the same what is happening in Mexico, what is happening in South Africa, is happening in the entire world. But in Mexico, nowadays, it's terrible, absolutely. There is no people coming to the States now because States has too many soldiers on the border. There is too many drones watching. The border is really well taken care. So people can't be here. They can't come here. But in every place, they are poor and poor and poorer every day. What we should do? What? What do you suggest to help those people? They are starving because they are being displaced from their land because the government solved already everything. So, for instance, now near Mexico City, they want a new airport. So all the land were farm or farmers' land, and they are murdering those guys just in order to get the airport. So what is the option for the poor? How we can directly, how we can help them?
Thank you, Ismail. Your question.
So I think Mexico is an excellent example because of the degree to which Mexico's economy has been integrated with the US economy over the past 150 years at least. That is, it's almost a lie to use the phrase the US economy or the Mexican economy as if they were two separate things. That is, they simply can't be separated. And the role of extractivism, whether it's through minerals or whether it's through agricultural products, but the use of Mexican labor, Mexican land, and Mexican resources to subsidize the exaggerated accumulation of wealth for the 1% and the exaggerated standard of living for the 85% of the United States is just absolutely essential. That is, there is no US economy without Mexican workers in Mexico who are planting and picking fruits and vegetables and who in previous generations were planting and picking henequen and sugar and who were mining copper and mining gold. There is no US economy without that. So this system of unequal exchange that I showed between the United States and Colombia has been deeply in place between the United States and Mexico since at least the 1860s. So how can we change that? That is, the United States and Mexico also are very strongly integrated politically. And when I talk about Mexican government policies and migration accords and the NAFTA, people always say, well, but why does Mexico's government agree to these things if they're bad for Mexico? And the answer is that, of course, Mexico's government does not represent the people of Mexico. Mexico's government represents the political party and the economic interests that have been controlling Mexico for many, many decades. So clearly, US policy towards Mexico, both economic in the form of NAFTA, for example, and NAFTA is a really good example where we see very acutely and very immediately that the heavily subsidized agribusiness-produced corn from the United States flooding markets and destroying the subsistence corn-producing sector, which has been one of the major sources of migrants to the United States, have come from subsistence corn producers who have been displaced very explicitly by NAFTA. So these are all the things we have to change. To give you a simple answer.
I think we have time for one more question, and you had your hand up.
So, with tar sands, they mostly employ prominently men. So in these regions where the mining is happening in Colombia, where men are moved into a region, is there an increase with like women's violence, women's intimidation, or human trafficking that you've observed or researched?
So this mine employs about 10,000 people, and it employs them at different levels. About 5,000 of them are full-time workers for the mine who are unionized, and almost none of those workers come from the region. They maintain their families in one of the cities. They don't live in these rural, remote areas. The other 5,000 people, so there has been agglomerations of people, especially among those who work as subcontracted workers for the company, who have fewer benefits. They do not have the job security. They don't have the health benefits. They don't have the wage and safety and Social Security guarantees that the unionized workers have. So they tend to earn less, they tend to be more transient, they're subcontracted, so they work, many of them, for sort of fly-by-night companies where the companies may disappear. So there has most definitely, so first of all, there's been a huge increase in displacement, which puts people into the sort of informal economies. And these economies can include things like living in the dumps and picking food and recyclable materials out of the dumps. They include things like prostitution, begging, selling crafts in the cities, or sending your children out as servants. So all of these things have included among the people who were displaced, and servicing the transient male mine worker population, whether it's through doing things like laundry or cooking or sexual services. So yes, there has been a lot of increase in a very exploited informal economy in the region. Not human trafficking per se that I'm aware of, but definitely a super exploited informal economy.